welcome everyone to session 5 in our third online seminar series of the year, all of which have been designed to help managers and leaders around the world deal with the pandemic as it was happening and get ready for when it's transitioning back to work in the workplace. And now we're on the third session, which is around success post-pandemic. Today's session is on leading diverse teams and organizations, and it's really focused on not only new knowledge, but also a toolkit that you can take away. I'm Melanie Weaver Barnett. I'm the Chief Executive Education Officer at the Ross School of Business. And I'm really pleased to welcome you today and just let you know that today's session, as mentioned, does have a key takeaway for you. And it's also about the more comprehensive completely online course that we have, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Teams and Organizations. Michael will share the link to that with you in the chat, or in the chat. And we hope you'll take a look at that, because I know DE&I is so important to so many organizations and managers and leaders. And the entire course is completely online, and it does have live interaction with faculty, with Lindy, as well as asynchronous work and interaction with your course colleagues. So it's a really cutting edge and very effective course that you can take if this topic is particularly important to you and your organization's success. So I need to go over a little bit of housekeeping details with you, and very quickly, you're in listen only mode and the chat is disabled, but the Q&A is enabled. So put your questions there. And if you have any technology issues, try getting out and back in, or accept the session without the video and watch it later. And by the way, when it comes to questions, we encourage you to ask questions both about the topic at hand and about the program itself, the larger program. Know that we will send you the link to the video of this session later, and we hope you will use it as a reference and share it with others as well. This series and the other ones that we've done are all about equipping you as leaders of some of the most important organizations in the world with actionable ideas that are evidence-based, so you know they're real, not just someone's idea of what worked for them in a particular situation at a particular point in time, but proven by the research that we and other academic researchers do to work. And Lindy will share some of that with you later in the session. Upcoming opportunities for you include our next live complimentary webinar, which is Wednesday, July 14th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And the title of that one is Igniting the New World of HR. And that will feature 4 professors, Dave Ulrich, Maggie Zhou, Wayne Brockbank, and Dick Beatty, all Michigan Ross professors. So we hope you'll join us for that. And then our upcoming courses include, I want to just direct you to the third one in that list, which is the one I mentioned, which is with Lindy, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Teams and Organizations. You can get online, sign up for that. It starts October 25th. And then we have 2 other courses we wanted to highlight for you. Becoming a Purpose-Driven Organization, which starts August 9th and runs through September 3rd. Again, all online. That one is all asynchronous. And then the Accelerated Management Development Certificate Program, which is a comprehensive 6-month certificate program. You get badges for each course and a certificate at the end. It has assurance of learning in it, and it includes the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion course led by Lindy that we just mentioned. You can see the link to our overall site at the end of this slide, and Michael will put that in the chat as well. So we're giving you a direct link to the DE&I course, as well as our overall executive education programs. My last thing before I turn it over is to introduce Professor Lindy Greer to you. Lindy is Associate Professor of Management and Organizations, Faculty Director of the Sanger Leadership Center at the Ross School of Business, and Faculty Director of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Executive Education programs. As with all our faculty who do executive education work for us, Lindy has deep and broad qualifications in 3 critical areas: research, teaching, and real world experience with organizations and corporations. In the realm of research, she has received awards from the Academy of Management for her research on effective leadership, with specific focus on conflict management, diversity and inclusion, vision crafting, and communication around emotions, which is something you may not think about, but is actually critical to effective leadership. She's the associate editor of the Academy of Management Journal and has received numerous awards from these institutions as well. In the realm of teaching, she is known as a master teacher. She received recently our Executive Education Teaching Award. She teaches in our degree programs and our executive programs and gets some of the highest ratings of any faculty members who teach at the Ross School of Business. And she has a broad scope of experience in organizations and corporations themselves. One of her most recent ones was a partnership with us in executive education. She worked with one of the largest wellness and fitness organizations in North America. And it wasn't just a training program. We worked with them to do a diagnostic, to get a diagnostic research, a sense of where this organization, what their current reality was in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lindy has developed a diversity, equity, and inclusion scorecard, and the group implemented that scorecard. They did a 6-week-long training with the C-suite, where they worked through the research and best practices and decided what their goals were and how they were going to track them through this scorecard. We employed executive coaches to work with each of the members of the C-suite to work through their emotions around the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then developed a plan to cascade, a plan that include training and so on, to cascade this throughout the organization. There has been transformational change in this organization already, including they've developed a meeting playbook that they use regularly to ensure that meeting leaders and meeting participants use the techniques that lead to better inclusion. They've changed their personnel practices. They've done workshops throughout the organization, and they are seeing movement in their numbers around both diversity and, importantly, inclusion as well. So I want to introduce you to Lindy, and I'm going to let her take it over from here. I hope you enjoy the course and ask us lots of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. That was such a kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to join with you today to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. This has been my passion for over 20 years in my research life now, in terms of understanding how we can leverage differences around us to learn, to grow, whether that's helping our organizations perform better or creating justice in the world. So I wanted to share with you today a crash course, if you will, of what I think are the most important things you could know in 40 minutes or so around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Whenever I teach on these topics, though, I'm always a little leery of one-off workshops, as I feel like the work that we all need to be doing in DEI can't be done in a one-off session like this. And so if you're interested, I really encourage you to join our program in October, or consider joining any type of longer-term program in DEI, where you have the chance to really go deep and process the emotions that come up around some of these topics, because they are very emotional to all of us in different ways. As I go, I also want to have to throw out there that I think is important when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, to come from a place of humility, vulnerability, and openness to feedback. I'll do my best as I go to share my learning journey in DEI, and be very open with you that I am still learning, as we all are, and I love feedback. So if there's anything that I say today that doesn't land well, or you think that I could be pushing my perspective more, let me know. I love the feedback, and I really am seeking to grow, and hope I can learn alongside you as all of us work to advance this really important work within our organizations. So organizations right now are facing pressure on so many fronts to do more and to take action. We've seen Black Lives Matter in the United States really force companies to come to the table to figure out what they can do around DEI and how they can take a more proactive stance to embrace diversity for all the different reasons it adds value, be it for moral justice, for the business case, for the learning opportunity. We've seen it in Europe. We've seen the Women's March in London. There's increasing awareness even in the European context. You even see it around the world with issues like LGBTQ, that everywhere around the world, we're having to think about diversity. It may mean different things in different countries. And so as I go, I will try to approach this topic from a global mindset, as well as giving attention to some of the very hot topics within different geographic settings as we go. So a little bit of the overview for today. So I'm first going to look at why DEI. What are the opportunities for diversity? What are the challenges and the reasons why we need to be working on things like our own behavior and our company to support diversity? Why are things like allyship, equity, and inclusion needed in the conversation around diversity? And then I'll break it apart into 2 key areas of action items. Again, this is just tip of the iceberg for what's out there on DEI, but what I sort of feel will be sort of the key nuggets that you can walk away and do something with today, hopefully. So I'll first talk about what we can do within our own growth in DEI, because it's very hard, to make change in the world until we change ourselves. And so sort of helping us stay at top of mind for each of us, how we can keep growing in terms of DEI ourselves, how we can become more self-aware and find ways to be concretely anti-bias in our daily lives and a better ally to those around us. And then I'll move into more the organizational level of analysis of what are the policies, the processes, the playbooks, the best practices that we can be putting into place in our teams and organizations to create more equity and inclusion. Quick call out to the course. So the course itself is structured in a similar way. So it's in October, 8 weeks or 8 sessions across 5 weeks. And it will also work through individual behavior change as well as DEI at the organizational level, including tools for inclusion and equity, as well as best practices right now for strategy for your organization as a whole and how you engage in strategic change around DEI, which is definitely unique within the realm of change management because of the moral component, the emotions component that makes DEI strategic change hard, even though it's so important. So before I get too far, basic definitions to get on the same page and make sure we're not having any assumptions on this. If I say diversity, I mean any difference that can make a difference. This could be gender, it could be race, it could even at times be something like your favorite sports team. Whenever a difference leads to the perception that someone is other, that to me would be relevant for the study of diversity. And it looks different around the world, what is more salient. In America right now, race and gender are very top of mind, LGBT. Gender is one of those ones that's interesting as it is truly a global difference. And in multinationals, it's usually one of the top of mind characteristics. However, in America right now, race probably has more attention. And so we'll be talking about local and global perspectives on this as we go. Equity, basic definition is fairness, realizing that fairness is so much harder to achieve than we realize. And many of our processes and systems, despite our best intentions, often don't truly live up to the ability to be truly fair and to give equal opportunities for all and equal access. We'll then move into inclusion. And inclusion is really interesting. I feel like inclusion is one of those words that's often poorly misunderstood and poorly used. Inclusion can often be seen as, oh, we're all friends. We all feel like we belong here. But if you look on the research on psychology, inclusion at its heart should be built on theory and optimal distinctness. That people are at their happiest when they have a balance between a sense of belonging to a group, as well as a place they feel free to be an individual and to be unique. And so when you're working on inclusion in your organization, it's important to be measuring both sides of inclusion, if you did an inclusion scorecard, as well as to be balancing how to help both sides of this, because organizational practices to increase a sense of belonging, such as t-shirts that are all the same, or a day where you celebrate your shared values, that could come sometimes at the cost of the ability for people to differ, which is a hard adversity, and to feel free to share their uniqueness. So it's important that you're working on both levers simultaneously in your organization. When you're doing assessments on this, it's also interesting often that managers differ of which half of inclusion they're better at endorsing, whether they're better at creating safety for people to express their full selves at work, or they're better at creating that sense of belonging. And ideally, well-rounded managers and leaders can do both. They can create a sense of group based on values that are shared, but they also can create safety and freedom for people to differ from the group norm and to truly bring that diversity into the workplace. So the challenge of all this, I really want to stand still by. And there's actually interesting research on this showing the best way to talk about diversity, which also echoes the truth in the research, which is diversity is good and it's also hard. If we just walk out into the world and tell everybody diversity is good and stop there, it doesn't acknowledge the lived experience, and it actually can sometimes push people away from the table. And so, a first easy best practice on DEI is building on the work of Lisa Leslie at NYU, Dr. Lisa Leslie, that when we talk about DEI, it's important to acknowledge that it's tough, that diversity is good, and it's also hard. So let me show you quickly one example of what I mean by it as I get into why we should be talking about DEI. So one of my favorite studies was done by Dr. Kathy Phillips. The late Dr. Kathy Phillips was one of the leading Black scholars in the history of this field. And she looked at a study where she looked at a lot of different groups interacting, and there was an objective performance outcome for their decision quality. She asked the groups that were similar versus different, and she looked at different dimensions like gender, race, minimal group differences, etc. The groups that were similar, they thought they did really well when they worked together. You can imagine a group of people who all get along pretty well, say your friend group. You make a decision together, you're like, yeah, that was fun, we got along, we agreed easily, we know we did well. And then she asked a group that was different, that had different perspectives, different backgrounds, different life experiences, different demographic differences, how they did. And they weren't so sure. They disagreed. There was difference, and difference is uncomfortable. That's why we shy away from it. And so they weren't so sure how they worked through that to reach a good outcome. Well, you can imagine where I'm going with this. Guess who actually made the better decision? It was a group that had a little bit of discomfort, where people were different. They had different viewpoints. The groups that were similar, that really all got along, they suffered from something we call groupthink. That they didn't really diverge. They didn't have a devil's advocate. There wasn't debate. There wasn't different information brought to the table. So even though it felt really good, it wasn't what yields a good outcome. And so it's really important to stand still by this idea that diversity is good. It allows us to learn, process information, make better, more innovative decisions. At the same time, it's really hard, and people shy away from it because they're uncomfortable with discomfort. So one of the most important things in DEI work, in my view, is helping people get comfortable with discomfort and to not run away from it when we see it, but to be able to sit in it from a place of calm and curiosity, presumption of good intent, and ask questions and really seek out that discomfort to make ourselves and our teams and our organizations better. When I talk about the value of diversity, I do want to make sure that I stand still by all three reasons for it. The moral case for diversity is clear. It's front and center right now in society. There is also a business case to be made for it. Dr. Scott Page at Michigan Ross also does great work for us on DEI, has a great book called The Diversity Bonus that really walks through the business case for diversity. And there's also a learning case, which correlates to some extent, as you can imagine, with the business case. When you're talking about diversity with others, there's actually also been research about how to talk about diversity beyond just as good but hard, that especially for people that are newer to the journey on DEI, starting at the case for learning is something that everybody can agree on. Almost everyone has been in a situation where someone that thought differently from them prompted them to learn something. And that clearly doesn't get into issues of social justice, but it's a starting point to agree to move forward. So when I'm teaching in DEI, and as I will do today, I will be starting at the learning case and moving from there and moving our way towards social justice. It's always so hard when you're working on DEI because people are coming at very different places in their journey, of whether they're social justice warriors or new to the table. And so for me today, and when I teach on this, I try to make sure that I'm bringing everybody to a common level of understanding and then pushing forward and offering opportunities and nuggets along the way for the social justice warriors to also run with as well. But at the end of the day, it's really important when you do this work in your organization to make sure that everybody's coming to the table together, that we're finding ways to hear one another out, finding things we agree on, and then pushing each other, challenging one another to move forward and to accelerate each of our journeys at whatever place that we're at. So why is diversity hard from psychology? I want to stand still by this now and get to the point of challenging a little bit. So diversity is hard because although the diversity brings us different levels of information, be it gender, race, or even our favorite sports team, differences in information, it also can activate processes in our brain that categorize others into in-group versus out-group, friend or foe, us versus other. To other out-groups, we tend to attach bias. We want our group to be better. It's an automatic tendency from our brain. Our brain only functions as a computer does in binary code, yes, no, good, bad, right, wrong. It uses these very simple codes to make sense of the world. We couldn't get through the day without our brain lumping things into categories. It's the way we process information. Even something as simple as what is your favorite color that you seek out? Well, that is a category that now has a bias attached to it. Unfortunately, our brain also does this for people. Our brain automatically categorizes people into in-groups and out-groups. When these categorizations are done systematically over time in societies, it leads to structural inequalities between certain groups, where certain groups are more often categorized as out-group and have access to less opportunities. This then can play out in our organizations and society in nefarious ways. And it's important to understand this linkage between what my brain does in a nanosecond versus what this leads our society to do, over the course of 100 years. As we're talking about these categorizations, I do want to stand still by the idea that there's many types of categorizations, that all of us hold multiple identities. We have racial identities, economic identities, ethnic identities, ability identities. I'd encourage you now to take a second to pause by this and think about, what are your identities? As we're talking about DEI, I think it's really important to come from a flexible mindset where we can lean into different experiences along the way. For me as a white woman, I have experienced sexism. I've also shown sexism to other women. I don't mean to, but when your brain is on automatic pilot in animal mode, in the words of Kahneman, beast brain, and you're tired and you're not thinking, you can show bias towards others. Being white, I've experienced privilege. Growing up in a lower economic family, I've also experienced disadvantage. And so I have a complex identity, as all of us do. And so I'm able, it's really important to be able to access both sides of this. So to recognize moments of privilege, recognize moments where you've shown bias, have the humility to take the feedback on it, realizing it's going to be a lifelong journey. And at the same time, also to then have empathy for those experiencing bias, because most of us have experienced bias in some form ourselves. When you're teaching on DEI and working on this in your organization, this is usually the first stepping stone to go to. It's helping people access the complexity of the personal identity. It helps get people on the same page and have the willingness and compassion and empathy to want to hear one another out and to be curious. At the end of the day, that's what we really need in DEI work, is that willingness to be curious and get to know one another and to understand and find ways to update our behaviors. So why is this important too? So when we're on, moving our identities are intersectional, and this is implications. So one thing I always stand still by is, if you look at white men, Asian woman, white woman, it's different experiences. So I don't want to get away from that point that intersectionality is a key concept as we move through this, and that all of these identities have important implications in society. So what I briefly alluded to is our brains sometimes work against us and sometimes works in terms of categorizations, which leads us to not necessarily be the best version of ourselves. And the point is, we all do this, which is hard for many people to deal with. So one of my favorite quotes in this that I wanted to share comes from a book. A quote in the book was, "As I was boarding, I saw that the pilot was Black. I'd never seen a Black pilot before, and the instant I did, I had to quell my panic. How could a Black man fly an airplane?" But a moment later, I caught myself. I had fallen into the apartheid mindset, thinking that flying was a white man's job. I sat back in my seat and chided myself for my thoughts. Any guessing who this is? Well, one of the heroes of the civil rights movement around the world, Nelson Mandela. And I just love this quote because it shows how we all do this every day, all day. But he had developed his muscle to catch himself in the act before he refused to get on the plane, before he made a comment on what his thought was. He was able to observe it, have compassion for himself, say, hey, this wasn't a great thought, and move on. I wish all of us were able to have that level of superpower to recognize those moments in which we have that biased thought. Because the thing is, we live in a society that has smog all around us every day. If you turn on television, if you open the newspaper, certain categories are elevated above others, and we breathe that in without our awareness. Our brain that likes those categories is constantly looking for ways to simplify the world. So none of us want to be biased. None of us mean to be biased, but we live in a society where there's smog, and if we're not thinking, we breathe it in and we use it to make sense of things at an automatic, implicit, unconscious level. So how do we be more aware of it? How do we stop it? So one is realizing when we're likely to fall prey to any type of bias. It could be an anchoring bias, a negotiation, or it could be a racial bias. We're more likely to have our brain default to those categories when we're tired, when we're overwhelmed, we're in a hurry. If things aren't clear for how we should make a decision, if there's not a clear process, or success is too narrowly defined. At least for me, that when I'm teaching, it's a lot harder for me to be conscious of making sure that I'm calling on students from a diversity of backgrounds when I'm tired, when I didn't get enough sleep the night before. And so I really have to be conscious to be able to activate my system 2 brain for open-mindedness and to be aware of the conditions that push me out of it. It's really important because when we don't do this, these biases and categorizations that exist in our brain from society, they can lead us, even at an unconscious level, to change our expectations for others, to have different standards, to be biased in how we process information, which affects then how we evaluate others. This has implications for the workplace. I was shocked by these statistics about how rampant discrimination is across companies. Vast majority of people across the world in some form have had discrimination. It exists rampantly across many different identities, going back to the idea of identity complexity. If you look at gender, for example, one of the ways in which we see this is how much fallout there is in gender across the corporate ranks from entry level to C-suite. Melanie, please.
Yeah, Lindy, this is a question from Prem Kumar on, and it has implications for both individual and then, organizational effectiveness or movement in terms of DE&I. So when you have to choose between two candidates, should one compromise on quality for the sake of ensuring diversity? And, and then qualified with what I mean here is, do we focus on diversity only after all other parameters around the talent and the qualifications of the person remain the same?
Yeah, so the way that I would prefer to look at it is you can't hire someone for the sake of their color or their gender. You shouldn't. More so realizing though how deeply baked our biases are into these discussions, and that what we think is quality, we're often grossly inaccurate and highly biased. There's a lot of research showing that you can go into a hiring interview, and I'll mention this later, wanting to be fair, and you think you're going for quality. And if you're given people, and this has been research done over thousands of people, two identical resumes, and the title at the top is a man versus a woman. With identical resumes, 70% of the time, the man will be hired over the woman. And this has been shown to be true for also ethnicity as well. So at automatic pilot, our assessment of quality is not accurate and cannot be trusted. So a better way than just to hire someone because they're different is to find out how can we get much, much more accurate in assessing quality. And so best practices for equity in organizations include having a really good rubric for what you're evaluating. So if you're hiring someone, how good is your rubric? Do you have 5 different behaviors or skills that you're hiring against? And then when you converse about that person, are you holding yourself accountable to that rubric? What often happens in the course of an evaluation decision over who to hire is that because our brain, that animal brain that likes the categories, it keeps trying to justify, oh, hey, I want to hire the person who looks like the majority group in our society. So even if you think that you're going for quality, your brain tries to lure you into hiring the majority group. So there's also studies showing that if you have 2 resumes of a man and a woman, you've said in advance your rubric is you want to hire for education. Great, you have a man's resume with education, easy decision. But now if you have 2 resumes and the woman has a higher education and the man doesn't, during the course of that conversation, groups often then change the criteria for evaluation. Say, oh, actually, as I think about it, education just isn't that important. And so they change the rubric to justify still hiring the majority group person. And so there's been really interesting research by Shelley Carell at Stanford showing that if you have a criterion checker in a meeting, that actually is a better way to have better demographics across your ranks than hiring explicitly for something like race or gender, because that is, can create backlash or feelings of unfairness. But instead, just getting really good at being anti-bias and realizing that really hard. Every sentence we do, every word we say, like that example of Nelson Mandela, bias seeps into our thoughts so quickly. And so especially in those hiring decisions, how can you be aggressively anti-bias?
So, Lindy, it sounds like then, being aware of personal biases, being aware of group behaviors that then lead to group biases are really important in creating
Yep.
fairness and equity. We also know that when it comes to complex decision making, diverse teams perform better
Mm-hmm.
consistently. So you could make the argument that a diverse team is, unless your work is super simplistic, a diverse team is going to be better than a homogenous
Yep.
team.
Yep.
So should
Absolutely.
hiring managers also be thinking about that as one of the criteria for hiring?
Yeah, I mean, diversity in all forms makes a difference. And so if you're going through the sets of behaviors you need in a team, making sure that you're not just hiring for the same set of behaviors, but you're hiring for a diversity of behavior. Diversity of behaviors is important. It's also important to realize the stereotypes that we have and how we devalue some behaviors that are needed in teams. So for example, most teams, skills around being able to build relationships, manage meetings are really important. But because of stereotypes in society, we often don't put those on the list of things that we're looking to hire for. And so that's one of the ways, again, we're getting aggressively anti-bias, even in terms of the diverse set of traits you want in a team is really important.
Okay, great. And then there are a couple of comments here I think are
Mhm.
useful to add. Anna is sharing that with respect to hiring, she would also add that there is bias even before we see candidates in how we're establishing what the qualifications are, right?
Yep. Yeah. So I'm going to go there with the slides in a little bit, but yeah, absolutely. If you had to do the full pipeline analysis, this is where data is your friend and metrics in DEI work is ideally in your organization, you're tracking how many people in my community would be eligible, how many people worldwide demographically or whatever your target group is would be eligible to work at my company. Say that's 50% woman, 30, 40% Black. Okay. So who then applies to my job? If I find that that's not representative of the wider world, then there's something wrong in my job ad and or how I'm sourcing people. So you could run your ad through a job language editor to check for inclusiveness. It's amazingly how often we push away people from even applying by the language we use in job ads. And there's a lot of really cool tools on the web right now to put your job ads in for feedback on how to get it more inclusive. You also get to bring in, for example, people to help you source from non-traditional sources. I have a stat later, I believe it's something like 60% of jobs are sourced from personal networks, and our personal networks are biased and homogenous. And so how do you get out of your own personal network with hiring is really important, and bringing people to help with that. You could even say, okay, well, maybe my audience isn't as diverse as society. So maybe I should invest, our company should invest in development in the high school level to ensure there's more qualified candidates across demographic groups. That's just getting into the door. Then you hit interviewing, people ask different questions to people from different groups. They ask, for example, men questions that are about the big picture. They ask women questions about how to manage risk. And you can imagine that based on the data that's given in those interviews, you're more likely to hire the man because it's a better interview. But guess why? It's because of the questions the interviewer was asking. So how can you standardize the questions? Then it could be, okay, great, we have 3 final candidates. How do we choose whom we should hire? And then people shift away from the initial criteria because of biases. So with data, if you had a really good scorecard, you could see, okay, at which part of the pipeline is it getting leaky? Is it who applies to our job? Is it who gets interviewed? Is it how we make the decision on the people getting interviewed? And then once people are on the floor, where are they falling out? And so data is one of the most important things you can do to track this and make sure that you're addressing it, because equity is an issue, and being anti-bias at every single touch point you have with your workers.
Excellent. Thank you. It's really complex and deep. And so there's so many aspects at which bias creeps in. And therefore so many aspects of which we need to address when we're trying to create anti-bias in our organization. Ed is reminding us to be careful not to assume that diversity means a compromise in quality. And in
Yes.
fact, it doesn't. We know that diversity leads to better decision making and higher quality decision making, especially in complex situations. So I'm going to turn it back to you. There are some more questions, but we'll address those in a bit, Lindy. Thank you.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, and to Ed's point, like I really want to stand still by that study I mentioned with resumes. Exactly the same credentials, literally nothing different but the name at the top. We know then statistically significantly people are more likely to hire the man or the white person just based on that information with exactly the same credentials. And so hiring people that are different never will mean going for lower quality. It means removing our own bias. So more examples of why this matters. Structural inequalities lead to differences in wealth over time on race. I think some of these numbers are just astronomical to stand still by, and just realize the importance of this work for society as well as for our organizations. For the sake of time, I'm going to move forward a little quickly. Wanted to double click on just the idea: structural inequality is bad for society, it's bad for business, it kills innovation, it impedes diverse workforces. I thought the study from Citigroup was phenomenal, that structural racism alone, just looking at racism in America, has cost 16 trillion. And if you look at one of those stats, it's because of Black entrepreneurs couldn't get bank loans. And so then if you backtrack, okay, where did that 13 trillion come from? It came from those daily decisions in bank offices, where bank branch office managers would ask, for example, Black entrepreneurs different questions versus white entrepreneurs. And that then would lead to different decisions about how the loan was given. But it wasn't that Black entrepreneurs didn't have as good business ideas, but the way in which those bank branch offices were showing up led to outcomes that weren't equal and weren't necessarily based on merit, but were biased. So if we want to move on this and change our society and our organization, starts with self-change. If you want to change the world, start with yourself. It's very hard to credibly move DEI change if you're also not doing the work yourself daily. And again, it's work that all of us can and should be doing daily. There's always more to learn. There's always places where you need feedback. Where this journey looks like, understanding identity is usually the first step point over what is my complexity of identities, where I've experienced privilege, where do I show bias, where I've experienced bias, and understanding that all of us are multifaceted. There's interesting research showing that people that have lived abroad tend to be more open-minded because they've understand how to adapt to different worldviews. So for all of us, the more we can get out of one worldview and be open to others, it helps start the journey. The next step in this, as with anything, of admitting you have a problem is acknowledging bias. And this is really hard for people. This is where a lot of emotions come up because all of us have this idea that we're good people, that we're not part of the problem, we don't show bias. And that when you first come to terms with the data like we're talking about today, the first reaction is denial. Those numbers aren't true, it's not me, this doesn't exist. And so it's really important when you're doing diversity trainings to try to not have them be one-off, because you need to be able to catch those people before they run away in denial and dig in. But to give people a safe place to talk through this, work through those emotions. The next emotion after denial is often anger of, oh, I can't believe that you're telling me I'm a bad person. It's been interesting now about how some of the discussion around racism is even becoming illegal because people are so angry at the idea of acknowledging the isms of racism and sexism. And so the data in psychology is conclusive. Racism, sexism, structural inequality exists and it's there. But then how do we have compassion for ourselves and others as we work through those emotions? And for each of us, adopt a growth mindset that all of us have good intentions. No one means to be biased, and we're all just human beings which have brains that sometimes lead us astray. So how do we get better? How do we help others around us get better? And how do we work together to work through this? And one of the first steps is just acknowledging the role that we all play in bias in society. And then having the courage to grow, to learn, to ask questions, to get out of your comfort zone, be curious, and to start to develop awareness. That's why that Nelson Mandela quote was so great, right? It's like he was showing an amazing awareness in the moment of when his brain was falling prey into bias, caught himself and fixed it. And then engaging in continuous improvement for yourself, and then finding ways, ideally as quickly as we can get there, to help others and to be an active ally. So I want to give you a few quick nuggets for that and then go over to the organizational side. So again, what I mentioned on is a lot of emotions, and to have compassion for yourselves and others. And if you walk away from today saying, hey, this isn't true, I just didn't like that, try to catch yourself and acknowledge, like, is this a feeling of denial? Are you feeling bad about the idea that all of us have a place in this, and to work through that emotion before just pushing the material away. You also saw a lot of America last summer was stuck in shame spirals or depression spirals as white guilt over what was happening with Black Lives Matters. And so how do we take that information from that emotion, but then move forward to action? That's really important in the day that we're able to process these heavy, heavy, heavy emotions that exist around this and get to the place of acceptance so we can come together to solve things. And it means compassion for yourself, but also compassion for others, presumption of good intent, and willingness to work together to solve things. This takes a growth mindset. If you're not aware of this work by coming out of Stanford by Carol Dweck, Dr. Carol Dweck, I'd encourage you to go into it. It really looks at this idea that we all live in a gray zone. We're not good or bad, we're works in progress. Each day is a new chance to be better. For DEI work and DEI framing for you and for your organization, a growth mindset is critical. It has to be there in order to be able to have the humility and the willingness and the openness to go through this type of journey. So how can you be a better ally, as you're moving through this in actions on the individual level? One is just acknowledging the bias and privilege that we hold. Most of us have at least one identity upon which we've shown bias and have had privilege. We also probably have an identity upon which we've experienced bias. Engage with others in difficult conversations. Ask for feedback. Please send me emails afterwards today for feedback. I want to grow. Role model that for others. Open up yourself. And also then have the courage to engage in difficult conversations to call others out for bias. If you're in a hiring meeting and they're shifting the criterion, say so, call it out. If you're in a meeting where someone makes someone else uncomfortable, have that conversation. However, when you're doing so, make sure you're engaging always with empathy. It's really hard in this work because we get frustrated and angry, but empathy, first and foremost, and curiosity, because at the end of the day, we need to build bridges to solve all this. Connecting with others that are different from you and becoming an ally. And let me give an example of a really interesting data point on that. So one, as an ally, it's important to acknowledge these things and go on. So a quick study that's really interesting. So if you looked at Airbnb and just an example of how bias plays out, again, remember those two equivalent resumes. When Airbnb hosts are choosing guests, they accept guests with African American names 19.2% less than those with white sounding names. And so if you're coming from a racially underrepresented racial background, it's even harder to even just rent an Airbnb, right? Like, it's mind blowing all the ways in which racism shows up in the daily lives. However, this difference disappeared when the guest had positive reviews from a host. So a simple allyship thing you can do is positive affirmations, realizing that if people are other, if they are coming from underrepresented group, gender, race, take your choice, if you simply go out of your way to make sure that you positively affirm their work, their competence, their ability, maybe that's in a meeting, really calling out the good idea of a woman in your team or someone from an underrepresented group, that's a great way to start to be an ally. And it can reduce then the sexism, racism, etc. if you give positive affirmations and clearly call out the positives that someone has done. The flip side, in terms of calling out the positive, is also calling out the negative around you. If you see a microaggression in your team, if someone makes a biased comment in the meeting, if someone interrupts someone while they're talking, say something. It takes a lot of courage and also takes a lot of practice to do it well. In the course, we spend a whole lot of time on this. It's really important to learn the conversation skills, to have these conversations in ways that build bridges versus shame, blame, and push people away. But we need to do these conversations. So I quickly want to just do a few minutes, and I know we don't have a lot of time left, about organizational tools to make sure you walk out of here today with some tools at the organizational level. We know from a lot of research that if you're going to push diversity in an organization and prioritize and be anti-biased, you need inclusion to go with it. There's a lot of research showing that diversity bonuses are the best achieved when the companies also have an inclusive culture. 3 areas you can look at this in team meetings for inclusion: participation. Is there equal speaking time when you're brainstorming? Research shows that usually 80% of the conversation is dominated by 20% of the members. 5-person meeting, 1 person does most of the talking. That's not inclusive. It pushes people away from the table, and it leaves the diversity that you had in the room on the table because it's not being heard. So how do you fix that? Creating psych safety, having rotating leadership of meetings, sharing information in advance, making sure in your meetings everybody has 2 minutes to talk, keeping meeting size small so there's not too many people, so you can make sure that everybody does have a chance to speak, are all hacks. Next challenge for inclusion is conflict. Is when people are talking in a meeting, 70% of the time, if someone has a different view than us, we take it personally. 70%. That should be terrifying. So how then do we help teams express differences in ways where we don't take it personally, where someone can have a different view than our own and we can hear it? One of the best practices that I do for personal experiments, and is good to role model to a team, is anytime that someone has a different view from you, ask them a question before you share your opinion. In most meetings, you see someone says, I think we should do strategy Y. And then someone else says, well, I think we should do strategy X. And then they dig in and it becomes a personal conflict very quickly. In better team meetings, someone says, I think we should do strategy Y. Someone else says, hey, that's interesting. Could you tell me more? What is your reason for that? What is your logic? And then you jump in with other point of view, but people truly ask questions first. Dr. Allison Wood-Brooks at Harvard shows that this type of asking people to elaborate on their opinion has been shown also to improve relationships, even romantic relationships, family relationships, by just taking the time to ask someone more before you share your point of view. And that's a great way then to also understand that usually people are coming from a place of good intent. And if you can ask them why and to explain their reasoning before you judge or before you give your opinion, it can build relationships. Final one on inclusion, and I love some of the work on this, is the role of influence and impact. Even if you have a diverse team in the room, even if they're all speaking and now you're having a debate, we usually only let the person decide who spoke the most, has the most senior job title, or looks like our prototype of leadership in society. Instead, we need to make sure that in our teams, the final decision goes to the person that had the most data, which may not be the formal leader, it may not be the person that talked the most, and it may not be the person that comes from a majority demographic group. And so how do we get really open to following data? This can come from the leader role modeling or appreciation from data. It can come from sharing leadership or rotating leadership. But whoever knows most in a team leads that discussion and makes the decision. Looking at leadership skills for inclusion, it means a willingness to empower people to take action in DEI. It especially means from leaders humility, willingness to acknowledge your mistakes in DEI and to ask for feedback. It also takes courage to get out of your comfort zone, to sit in discomfort, to have hard conversations. And it means a willingness to be accountable, to use data, to get feedback, to build in mechanisms to ensure that you're doing the work. So on equity quickly, equity now is moving into fairness. And so what we know is that fairness is really hard. Most workers see bias day to day, half. And there's a lot of great stats in the world on this. The average American CEO is 6 feet tall, average American man is 5'9", the average American woman is 5'4". There's probably not an objective reason why being 6 feet tall makes you a better CEO. But again, those categories in our brain lead us to put that type of person into leadership more. If you search for Google images, this is the smog that our brain is breathing in about who should be in a leadership position. So how do we fix our decision-making in organizations to be fair, to be anti-bias? First off, what not to do is believe that you or your organization are fair and meritocratic, because researchers say no organization is, and it's also going to be a gray zone. There's no organization that's fully meritocratic. You might be 70% there, but more likely you're closer to 50%. So how do you let go of that belief and be open to this idea that there's more we can do to be anti-bias? Being gender or race blind also doesn't help, because our brain has categories. As much as we try to say that we don't see it, our brain is seeing it, even if we don't admit it, it's filtering into our thoughts. Unconscious bias training one-off also can do more to hurt than help. So having longer acting change, longer acting training is really important. So what does help? Data. Tracking your diversity numbers across a pipeline to see where you have a leaky pipeline, where there's bias in it. Fixing it. Benchmarking, comparing, formalizing things. The more you have those rubrics, formalized processes, online language editors for job ads, you standardize the same interview questions for candidates. So you don't ask, male candidates different questions of female candidates, criterion checkers in meetings. So formalizing everything you do around people decisions is really important for equity. Also for feedback processes. There's a lot of work showing, for example, that people from underrepresented groups get vaguer feedback than people from majority groups. So for example, men get very clear feedback of their performance reviews over do strategy X, do this behavior, do this. And then woman candidate gets feedback like, well, you might be more warm. So how do you get really accountable to make sure you're very fair, very specific, very consistent in all the things you do? There's also even work, for example, on the office setting of how there's inequities in that if you walk into your office and all the paintings are of one group, anybody who's not at that group will feel uncomfortable. And we know from research and stereotype threat that if you're in a situation where the objects around you don't look like you, your brain works less effectively. And so how can you have even an office setting that's truly fair and equitable for everybody to have a fair chance at success? Personnel decisions are the most tricky. There's a lot of research on this specifically about how to work towards equity there. So having that good rubric and criteria, and then rating people with numbers and criteria, ideally not knowing their demographics if you can. Dr. Lauren Riviera at Kellogg has great research on this, that if you do a 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 to evaluate candidates, you're more likely to have bias, because underrepresented groups, it's hard for them to be exceptional enough to get an odd number like a 5 or a 7. So 1 to 6 is the best scale to use for evaluating for equity. Again, there's so many ways in which bias is baked into our brains. Making sure you have criteria that's based on behavior, skills, questioning criteria that's about style or personality, slowing down and spending the same amount of time discussing every applicant, and then using this criteria monitors to make sure you don't shift criteria to justify discomfort with people they may not look like the majority group. There's a lot of data on this I don't have time to go into. But so one example of this, a great case study, if you want to read more about it, was GoDaddy and how they completely updated their scorecard, their processes, they did the criterion checkers, and they were able to meaningfully change their diversity demographics within the company, which helped firm performance, and not by hiring for diversity, but by being aggressively anti-bias at every step of the pipeline. So we talked about personal growth. For organizational growth, equity, inclusion, that DEI growth journey, and making sure DEI is not a side job. It's built into every single part of the organization, to the culture, to the hiring, your meeting playbooks, all the things. So we hope to see you in our program. Today was just a very brief snippet. There's a whole lot more depth there. If you want resources, books, articles, or ideas for more on this topic, I would love to connect, so feel free to reach out, and I also love the feedback. Thank you so much for joining today. Melanie?
Yeah, thanks, Lindy, so much for giving us like new ways to gain more new insight, ways to gain more insight and actionable ideas for creating anti-bias throughout our organizations. Several people are asking, as you know, we're sending out the recording, but people are asking as well if we will send out the slides, and that's always, yeah. Okay, we will send
absolutely happy to share.
Thank you, because we did, as someone mentioned, we were skipping over some for time, and there's some great stuff in there. People are asking what is the difference between the MOOC course on Coursera and this one, and I'll share with you what I've shared, and then you can add on to that. So our executive education course has live interactive sessions with Lindy. It has a small, intimate group of executive learners as opposed to potentially thousands in a MOOC. So there's more rich interactions and networking. There's direct feedback from the instructor. We have subject matter experts playing a role along the way in the course that will be very helpful to you. There are interviews with corporate DEI practitioners and leaders. The quality of the platform itself is much better. The learning experience is better. The videos are better, etc. And importantly, too, I think is official recognition with the University of Michigan Ross School of Business badge for completing this course. And if you complete the entire Accelerated Management Development Certificate program, there is a recognized certificate. You'll get a digital and a hard copy of a certificate, not just recognizing you for participating, but there are assurance of learning elements along the way that you must complete, and you have chances to redo them until you actually get it. And so there's assurance of learning built in, and the badge and the certificate will recognize that as well. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Lindy.
No, I agree with everything you just said. I'm really excited about our external speakers coming in from high positions in companies to share their thoughts about the work they're doing within their organization. The quality of the videos and the platform is much better. And there's also just a chance to connect. On Coursera, I don't get to meet the learners at all. So I'm really excited for this opportunity with this course to get to know the people going through it, to brainstorm together on ideas for best practices. I really build more relationships together with Ross, with all the people doing work on DEI around the world.
Awesome. If you have time, I'll throw a few more questions at you from the
Sure.
participants. Okay.
I do.
So you mentioned, regional country differences in what diversity, equity, inclusion means and how to address that. So a couple of folks from India are asking, I'm going to share with you two questions that are very much related. In India, have you made any study on the diversity in organizations? Because it is not just race or color, unlike in the US and Europe. There are plenty of other factors in India, like the traditional caste system, religion, and so society is divided into economic classes based on wealth. And Ashkat Sinha adds that there's more religion bias than any other. What measures should we take to improve or to remove that bias in India? As in India, people stick towards one thing belonging to a particular community, whether they're Indian or not Indian. So if you could address that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I haven't done research myself on India. I've read research of others on India and completely agree that religion is probably one of the biggest challenges for DEI and organizations in India. And the best practices we went through today are equally important for any type of difference. How we make categories with our brain, whether that's on religion, gender, or race, and how do we build in mechanisms to catch ourselves? So for example, the work I've done in India, I often see a lot of hiring done on networks there, as much as, or if not more, in the United States. And so how can you get out of networks for hiring, use recruiters, proactively search in different groups than what the majority group is in your company for hiring? Language editors for inclusiveness. The more that you can also remove knowledge of the demographic that's challenged from resumes and or the interview process. There's a really famous studies done by orchestras, right? That when musicians interviewed live on stage, the orchestras were predominantly white male. And the minute they put curtains up, it changed. However, it was very interesting. It was the first time they put the curtains up in the first set of studies, nothing changed. And then one person was able to ask, oh, hey, actually it's because you can hear the clickety-click of high heels on the stage. And so people still knew in some part of their brain that it was a woman walking out there. And so they gave her lower scores automatically. They didn't mean to do it because she was a woman, but just because your brain associates a woman with less confidence. They put down the carpet, and after that, then they're able to achieve equity. And so there's ways, especially in HR, to remove knowledge of, say, the religion and the application process to the best of your ability.
Great, thank you. So part of what this series is about is, dealing with emerging from the pandemic situation. So I'm going to again combine two questions from Agustina and Praveen. So Agustina is saying, what are some of the learnings in terms of DEI that came out of the pandemic, and which are some of the challenges for organizations? And Praveen is noting that the employees who return to the office after a year of remote work and dealing with all of these situations aren't the same employees that their bosses may remember from the workplace. And what aspects of that must we deal with?
Yeah, I'm actually working on a research paper right now about how DEI and the pandemic have been intersectional in a lot of ways. We have more stress, our fuses are shorter right now because of the pandemic, and as we come back into the workplace, our social skills are less polished than they were. And so our willingness to be able to sit in discomfort, presume the best in others, and engage with curiosity is probably at an all-time low. And yet diversity is front and center more than ever. And that's just a really difficult intersection right now. And so especially for managers, finding ways, it sounds silly, but the researchers support this, to engage in self-care, of get sleep, get exercise, and make sure that when you show up to your team in person again in the new normal, that you're able to role model a willingness to sit in discomfort, to show empathy, to show curiosity, to presume good intent, not to squash difference, not to shy away from discomfort, but to have the courage. And that means a lot of self-care yourself in order to role model that, and then helping your team, having a lot of one-on-ones to help coach people. There's a lot of research in the client that Melanie mentioned earlier. We found the biggest lever for inclusion within the company was mentoring and coaching relationships, both for basically opening up the black box of promotions to people from underrepresented groups, as well as helping those from majority groups and everybody across the organization to work on their inclusive behaviors, through having managers who are willing to invest in those difficult conversations at times of, hey, the way you showed up in that meeting wasn't optimal. Here's the way you can move forward differently.
Awesome. Hey, I'm talking to Michael now behind the scenes. People are asking for the website address for the course. I think the chat is not enabled, but you could just put it in the Q&A, and I think everybody can see the questions. So Michael, if you would pop that into the Q&A so everybody can see that. And let's see, let's do one more question on gender. Well, there are questions about gender and age. Have you done much research on age discrimination in your work? And what would you say about that?
Yeah, so within my work, I've looked at across a whole host of differences, we have bias across any difference that is a majority group, be that age, if we're in an organization where the average age, say a startup, is 28, ageism is very alive and real towards older workers. The solutions for all the isms are the same. That being said, the structural inequalities that exist across certain demographics are different. Being Black in America is a different walk than being a woman versus being 50 years old. Bias exists across all these dimensions, but I think it's also important to acknowledge the depth of the structural inequalities that varies across these differences. But yes, there is definitely ageism, sexism, racism. Even if you're at Michigan Ross, maybe a little bit of Michigan Ross above someone from Ohio State or Michigan State. Historically, that's all forms of bias, and the solution for all forms of bias is the same. But the pathway to get into an organization, the trenches are even deeper for certain groups other than others, and correcting for that, acknowledging that, and helping with that is really important.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much. And then one final question. And by the way, everyone, we will be sending you the video in an email, a link to the video. We will send you the slides, and we will include the link to this course online, and you can look at it online, get as much information as you can. Contact us. There's contact information all over the place. We're really happy to just get on a Zoom call with you or on the phone and talk you through the course and any questions you have about it. So one final thing, Lindy, all the questions are important. I think this one is something a lot of people are thinking about, and that's with regard to gender equality, which has been highly impacted due to this pandemic. Women are leaving the workforce more rapidly due to increasing, demands on work in the home and children and so on. So any thoughts about what organizations can do to remedy this?
So one, having conversations around it, putting it out into the open. That is not something that's discussed just within women's professional groups within the organization, but it's seen as a challenge to employees by management itself. And so elevating the topic to discuss for what the options are. I also think, and again, I'm going to keep harping on the same agenda here, but removing bias in day-to-day discussions, because of sexism that exists, every time a woman walks into a meeting, if she's at home with 3 children, she walks into a meeting and then she gets interrupted, like that is a straw that is just breaking at that point. I've certainly seen this during the pandemic. And so how can we also, that's something we have immediate daily control over, for all of us, myself included, is how am I receptive, respectful, empathetic to others in my team, and to make the journey easier for those that are coming into the meeting that had a bigger burden than we might have had that day. And also thinking about structural remedies at the organizational level. There's a lot of important work on change management. And, there's a question in the chat too about coalitions. And so whenever there is an important challenge around DEI like this, how do you get the right people in the room? Really do a good power analysis of the organization, find allies. And for those of you able to be allies or have power and privilege within your organization, how can you be watching for groups like that to elevate and help, and working together to build guiding teams for these types of changes? And so this also, again, why mentoring programs are really important, and or allyship programs, where you're helping people understand how to work the power and politics of an organization in order to make meaningful change in DEI, including issues like gender equality coming back from the pandemic.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for active participation today, for all the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, but please contact us with questions about the course, about having us come in and do something similar to what we described. We did with the fitness organization and have done with other organizations. We know we are all works in progress with regard to DE&I, as Lindy said, as individuals and as organizations. And we'd love to get into dialogue about this and help each other grow. All right. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you next month, and hope to see you in our course as well.